Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. Your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I'm joined once again by David Mirsch, a frequent guest of the History Valley podcast. And today, we're going to be talking about the Swoon theory again. And this time, I want to get into the nitty-gritty fine details of this theory with him. And we're going to be laying out all the evidence. This is going to be a long video. So we're going to start out with that, and then eventually we're going to shift and talk about the dating of the New Testament as well, his dating of the New Testament, that is. So what would you consider to be the best evidence for the Swoon theory?
Yeah, we've talked about that before, and I'm trying to think what the best evidence is. I think the empty tomb plays into it very much so. I think the post crucifixion sightings of Jesus play into it very heavily. I also think that the Gospels put in enough information so that somebody who's really looking to understand what was going on there as a human agency type of thing, they make it kind of clear how they did it. And the fact that there is a magic trick that would have contributed very easily to a pseudo resurrection. So those things are really pretty much primary to why I feel that, the Swoon theory is really the best explanation for what happened with Jesus.
And you also use the story in Joseph and Asenath as additional evidence to explain away some of the miracle stories in the Gospels. You were talking about, we talked about that before. When you look at Joseph and Asenath, you find connections with sweating blood.
Oh yeah,
talk
absolutely.
about that.
I think it's pretty clear, at least it's pretty clear to me, that story about Joseph and Asenath is really written about Jesus's parents. That, scholars have always said, well, why isn't there any information about his family outside of, the Gospels and the New Testament and all that? And there actually was. There was this, I think you would call it a Mishnaic kind of reworking of the Old Testament story about Joseph and Asenath. And in the first century, somebody came along and took that and molded that story to fit Jesus's parents. The thing about the story specifically is that Asenath the name Asenath is a theophoric, which is a name that includes the name of a deity. And the deity involved in the name Asenath is Neth or Neith, which was the Egyptian goddess that was considered the Virgin Mother goddess back in antiquity. And that right there tends to tie her. And I know this title has been given to many, many goddesses in the past and stuff, but that's one of the first things to me that ties her to Jesus and his mother, Mary. The second thing is that Asenath, when she's under stress, sweats blood in the story. And that to me is a very, very telling sign that this is a story about his family, his mother. There is a genetic disease that is transferred from mother to son, and it's called G6PD or Fauvism. And people that have it, and they're especially in the Middle East, it's prevalent, tend to have hemolytic anemia when they eat fava beans and certain other triggers. And so seeing Asenath sweat blood and knowing that in the Gospels, Jesus sweated blood when he was under stress, and that he also had water and blood come out of his side when he was poked with the spear while he was on the cross, those are signs of hemolytic anemia. And at one point I spoke with a hematologist, a very famous, nationally famous hematologist down in La Jolla, California, and asked him about it. And he said, yeah, that's absolutely a sign of fauvism or G6PD, that the red blood cells break down and leak fluid into the bloodstream so that you get a situation where it appears like there is water and blood, either in your sweat or in the wound or whatever. So that was pretty compelling for me. The other thing is that the description of where Asenath lives it mentions all of the salient features of the Jerusalem temple at the time, from towers where she lives to how many floors were in the tower to streets that went by the temple, and most importantly, a fountain that watered the plants that were in the courtyard of the temple. That correlates very closely to the Jerusalem temple. And the fountain would have been the spring, the Gaion spring that was on the Kidron Valley side of the temple. And that fountain was known in antiquity as the Fountain of the Virgin. And the story was back then that was where Mary came to wash Jesus's swaddling clothes. She came down to this spring or this fountain to wash his swaddling clothes. So even from antiquity, there was a connection between, the family and the temple. And I think the Asenath story really points that out too. Oh, and the other thing is too, is that, because I believe that Joseph Caiaphas was actually Jesus's father. When Joseph in the Asenath story is mentioned, she indicates that the Joseph in the story was abandoned by his father. Well, the Old Testament Joseph was not abandoned by his father. He was abandoned by his brothers. His father loved him very much. But in Jesus's time, in his lifetime, his father Joseph was called Caiaphas. It was kind of a nickname. He wasn't called Joseph ben or Joseph bar Caiaphas. And so that kind of tied in with the Asenath story, that there was not a connection between those individual Josephs and their fathers. So I thought that was kind of a reference to Caiaphas. Those were the things that really kind of hit home with me.
So basically, you identify Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest of Jerusalem, with Joseph, the father of Jesus.
Yep, absolutely.
Whatever evidence whatever kinds of evidence is there that identifies those two as the same person, in your opinion?
Well, first and foremost, both Joseph and Jesus were known as tektones. That's the Greek term for what was translated for hundreds of years as carpenter. But now scholars are broadening that definition and saying, well, more likely it means a builder, could mean a stonemason, could mean, just a general contractor. Okay, good. But in Josephus, when he is talking about the building of the actual temple, he refers to tektones. He refers to specially trained priests that were taught a building trade to work on the temple, because they only wanted priests working and building on the actual temple structure. So that got me thinking, well, is there any possibility that the tektone used in the Gospels for Jesus and his father were actually meant to implicate them that they were priests and that they had worked on the temple? The interesting thing is that a ossuary was found, and archaeologists came out with this in 2011, I believe it was. and it was inscribed with the message, Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas, priests of, and I can't remember what order of priests they were from. And it also listed the town that they were from. Depending on the translation, either Jesus was identified as a priest, or both Jesus and Caiaphas were, noted as priests on that inscription.
I think you're talking about the order of the priesthood, the priests of the order of Melchizedek in the Epistle to the Hebrews.
I cannot remember if that was the one that was used or not.
Yeah, that's the only sect that Jesus was mentioned as being a high priest of. It's in the Epistle to the Hebrews.
It could be. I think it was something else, but I'm not sure right now, so I don't want to quote, that. But clearly, Caiaphas, and it wasn't Ben Caiaphas or anything like that. It was just Jesus. Well, son of Caiaphas, yeah. Then you start looking at the nativity scene, and you see that the mention of shepherds at the birth in the nativity scene. Well, when you explore that a little bit more carefully, you recognize that the term shepherd or shepherds was used about 20 times throughout the New Testament. And in every other case, it refers to some leaders, or leaders of the church, leaders of a community. So the term is interchangeable back then with leadership. And even, who was it, Philo? Mentioned in one of his works that, and he was very specific about it, shepherds means leaders, flocks means the common people, the population. So if you look at the nativity as the only one that isn't used in that way, statistically, you would say, well, that may be what they originally intended, that these were not real shepherds out in the fields. These were community leaders that were at this birth, this special birth. And you have to remember that the nativity scene it's a question of, well, the family is given all the gold and frankincense and myrrh. And if there were just normal shepherds there, that would be a problem, because back then shepherds were kind of considered to be thieves. They would graze their flocks on anybody's property without paying for that. They would kind of let the flocks go where they wanted to, and wouldn't compensate the owners of the land for what was going on. So they were not held in high regard. So I don't think you could hand over all this wealth to this, what is presented as a poor family in front of all these shepherds and all these other people that, and robbery was a real problem back then. I just don't see that. But I do see the fact that shepherds could, actually mean leaders of the community that were there. And I also think the reason that there was no room at the inn was because this family, Jesus's family, were a political danger to the Herods. And even though the custom in that part of the world is no matter who comes to your door, if they need shelter, you give them shelter. I think there was an unwillingness to have this family come in just because they were a real political threat to the Herods. And so therefore, a lot of the places that they went to weren't eager to invite them in, even though custom dictated that they should have. So you look at that, and you look at the fact that they're called tectones. You see the ossuary, you see the connection that Caiaphas had a son named Jesus. You start to get the idea that there's that connection there. And that the reason it isn't brought out more in the Gospels is because the Gospels were trying to protect any connection to the family, and they were trying to protect any biographical details about Jesus so that the Romans could not come after them. So, the idea that there isn't a lot written about biographical details for Jesus makes sense because, he was seditious. So he would have been a threat to the Romans as well as the temple priesthood, even though he and his father were priests. You know, they were going in a different direction. They didn't necessarily support the priesthood. And I think you see that in the story with Asenath too. You see that the Joseph there is kind of, he's on his own a little bit. He's so well known and so well liked, and such an important figure that he kind of goes his own way a little bit in the story. And then the last part is that in the story of Asenath, the son of the Pharaoh, which I think the Pharaoh in the story relates to Herod the Great, and his son, his eldest son at that point, is Archelaus. But in the Asenath story, the son of the Pharaoh wants to marry Asenath. And as a result of that desire, he plans to kill her two children and her husband, Joseph. And I think that relates to the slaughter of the innocents, that Archelaus probably wanted to do away with Joseph and Jesus, and maybe James or John as his brother, as Jesus' brother, so that there were two children at that time, in order to free up Asenath so that he could marry her, which is kind of reflective of what his father did. Clearing out people, killing off people and stuff to get what he wanted. So that too, when I saw that, and I kind of said, well, that could be the actual story behind the slaughter of the innocents, kind of brought the whole thing around too. So those are really the reasons why I make the connection between Caiaphas and Jesus. And one of there's so much, Jacob, there's just so much stuff. The other thing too is that if Caiaphas is the father of Jesus, and Caiaphas is the son-in-law of the high priest Annas in the Gospels, Annas is the abbreviated version of the name Ananias, which would make Ananias the maternal grandfather of Jesus. So when Josephus writes about Jesus ben Ananias, he's actually making the connection to the family. He's actually saying, okay, this Jesus was a descendant of Annas, the high priest in the Gospels. They didn't, in Josephus's story, he doesn't connect Jesus to Caiaphas, because I think Caiaphas was held in disgrace because of what happened with Jesus and the empty tomb. And Caiaphas was let go of his position at that time. But Josephus did connect Jesus to Ananias. So with all of that taken together, that to me seems pretty good evidence that there was some kind of a connection, and probably a paternal connection, between Jesus and Caiaphas.
So I'm assuming that when you look at the apocalyptic message of Jesus, son of Ananias, you find parallels with Jesus's message in the apocalyptic message in the Gospels.
Oh yeah, it's so similar. I mean, the wording is so similar, but it's more than just that. If you look at the Josephus account, he indicates that the Jesus ben Ananias, came on the public scene in 62 CE. That's the same year that his brother James was killed, and James was the leader of the Jerusalem church. Up to that point, I think Jesus had been in hiding. We'll get into the swoon theory and how he survived, but I think he was in hiding. But when James was killed, Jesus stepped forward again to kind of take control and to push the message. Now, when he came forward publicly in 62 CE, he hid his identity. And he hid his identity until 66 CE, when the revolt started and it no longer mattered whether he was recognized for the Jesus of the Gospels or not. So at that point, it was like, well, we're at war with the Romans, and I could be killed by them at any time. It doesn't matter whether they know I survived the crucifixion, and I lived to a ripe old age of my mid-70s. So he came out, and he was recognized. And Josephus, his description of him is very similar to how Jesus was portrayed in the Gospels. In other words, the Josephus description is about kind of a rube, country bumpkin kind of a guy from the sticks, and a madman and this other stuff. But basically, the gospel Jesus is presented kind of as a rustic guy, kind of from nowhere, Nazareth, nowhere. So they kind of match up. And then when you listen to both what Jesus ben Ananias said in Jerusalem and how Jesus in the Gospels was presenting things, their wording is very, very similar. It's a condemnation of the people of Jerusalem and Judea for not standing up sooner against the Romans. The last thing is, and this is to me really interesting because it's so subtle, in ancient tradition, who was it? Mary's mother was Anna, or Saint Anne in the Catholic tradition. That name in Hebrew, Anne or Anna, is spelled identically to Annas. So the tradition is making a connection between Mary, Jesus' mother, and Annas, the high priest, except in the tradition, they changed the gender. They changed it from a male to a female. Whether they did that on purpose to hide the actual connection, or whether it was incidental, or whether tradition had come along that somehow, some way, one of her parents was named Anna, and they just assumed that it was the mother, and not the father. Could have been that, but it's interesting that the tradition of Anne or Anna and Annas, the names are so similar that you kind of have to wonder, okay, is there a connection between Jesus's mother and the high priest Annas? So you see all this stuff and you go, yeah, he wasn't some poor guy. He came from a prominent, well-to-do family, and that's how he was supported in his ministry. And people have said that for a long time, that the women followers must have supported him. Well, his family would have been pretty rich if his father was the high priest. So I think there's enough there to, get people looking at it and scratching their heads and going, could this be true?
Assuming those identifications are correct, what does that mean for the Swoon theory?
Well, it puts his family in a position where they can make things happen to make the swoon theory work. So if you take a look at when Jesus goes to cleanse the temple, there are temple guards in that area where he was, specifically to stop any uprisings on the temple grounds. And yet Jesus comes in and turns over the tables and runs amok and whips people and all this kind of stuff. And apparently the temple guards did nothing, and Jesus walked right back out of there. Well, who's in charge of the temple guards? Caiaphas is. He's the high priest. He's in charge of, what they do. Could he have given them the word? Hey, somebody's going to come in and create a fuss. We don't want problems here. Don't do anything. Sure, very possibly. Who pushed for a crucifixion? Caiaphas did. Well, that's the only capital punishment that would have been survivable. You can't survive decapitation. You can't survive drowning. Maybe you could survive stoning, but if you did, you'd be a real wreck. So the plan was, I think, with the swoon theory, that he had to be in a position where he could survive whatever capital punishment they handed out. And Caiaphas kept pushing for crucifixion because he knew they could set it up so that Jesus could survive that. That's pretty much how it plays in, I think. Caiaphas was behind it. And the other thing too is that I'm a firm believer that in order to hide the true identity of people involved, Joseph, Jesus's father, is not connected to, his father. There's no Joseph, Ben, or Bar, anybody. So that kind of hides his identity. Caiaphas is understood to be a high priest, and therefore, with the way the stories are laid out, not connected to Jesus. And Joseph of Arimathea, I think, is Joseph Caiaphas. I think there were certain characters in the Gospels that were given three identities. I think Mary, the mother, and Mary Magdalene, and Mary of Bethany are all the same person. I think Joseph, his father, Joseph Caiaphas, and Joseph of Arimathea are all the same person. And the reason I think that is because the Romans, and scholars have kind of debated this, but the Romans had a tradition that they would only release a crucified victim's body to family members. And I think this is the point where Caiaphas runs into problems, that he goes to them as Joseph of Arimathea and requests the body, because he knows he's got to get Jesus down from the cross as quickly as possible. And so he goes to, Pilate or whatever and requests the body so that they can bury it. These are all things that play into how the family impacted the ability to perform the swoon theory. And they all make sense to me. Maybe other people will struggle with it, I don't know. But the Aramaic definition of Arimathea is the heights, and that is a play on Joseph Caiaphas being the high priest. That is just a little bit of a play on words to kind of, make it clear to people who understood that that's who that was. But yeah, the family was involved. I think the family would have been involved much, much earlier in Jesus's life. I think this is something that Joseph Caiaphas would have been aware of and planned as a plan B, say, to instigate a revolution against the Romans, the Roman occupation. And since that occupation had been going on since 63 BCE, Caiaphas and his family would have had plenty of time to learn things and figure out how to do it and put this all together to make it happen.
How do you think they faked his death? What were the techniques they used?
Well, and again, to me, the Gospels make it kind of clear. Clearly, I think Jesus would have been drugged. One of the things keep popping into my head, so you have to forgive me. I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit. The other connection I see with Jesus and Caiaphas is when Jesus is left behind in Jerusalem when he's a young boy, and the family goes off to head back to their home. And they finally come back after a day or two and look for him. And they find him on the steps of the temple. And he is teaching temple priests and rabbis and stuff. And he's sitting there, just fine, apparently. And the parents say, well, where have you been? And where would we have looked for you? And his response is kind of, where else would I be but at my father's home, the temple? Well, if his father was Caiaphas, the high priest, Jesus wasn't talking about God. He was talking about Joseph. He was talking about Caiaphas. That's where Caiaphas worked. Was his, I would assume his home, kind of. But that's what Jesus is telling them. Where else would you find me but at my father's home? And which is a natural thing for a kid that's been left alone to do. If he knows where his father works, he's going to go to that place and hang out and wait for his family to come back. Anyway, those are just some of the connections that I see. The details of how it was accomplished. We honestly have to start with the idea of the Emperor Tiberius in Rome. And we have to understand that he was kind of a laid back kind of emperor. He was not a hands-on kind of guy. In fact, he had Sejanus kind of running the empire while Tiberius hung out on his private island and had a very hedonistic lifestyle. But Tiberius's attitude towards the empire, towards the peoples and the different provinces and stuff like that, was kind of a hands-off policy. Don't mess with their local customs. Don't, change their laws or anything like that. Just kind of let things be calm. The Pax Romana and all that kind of stuff. We don't need the hassles, which would indicate to me that when Jesus was beaten and when he was scourged, far from being the bloody mess that is in the Mel Gibson movie and what apologists like to, say, well, Jesus went through all this and, his flesh was torn and ripped up and all this kind of stuff in a bloody mess. The local customs would have been a Hebrew, Jewish, Judean lashing, a Mosaic law. And that's 39 stripes. That's 39 whacks with a special whip, which is a short wooden paddle with a few leather straps that were intended to just go across the back if they were not supposed to be long enough to reach around the side of the victim. And if at any time during it, the victim lost control of his bladder or bowels or anything like that, the punishment was stopped. The victim was, cut loose, and they found other ways to impress upon that victim not to do whatever he had done. So the lashing and the Gospels give no details. They say he was scourged and he was flogged. Those are the two terms that are used in the Gospels. But they give no indication of any details of what happened, how bad it was, whatever. So I tend to go with the fact that it was a local custom. 39, he was supposed to get 39 lashes, and that would have been it. Yes, he might have been beaten by the Roman guards, but I even suspect that might not have been the case. So he's not a bloody mess when he comes out of there. And there's something that, tends to agree with that in the gospel stories. And that is that apparently Jesus died very quickly on the cross, much sooner than was customary for a crucifixion victim. And so, the Roman soldiers go to Pilate and say, he's already died. And Pilate is very surprised by that, because Jesus has not been beaten that much. He has not been scourged like a Roman victim would have been. So they send him back. They send the soldiers back to stick him in the side with a spear, not to kill him, but just to test to see if he has a physical response to that pain. And that's when the blood and the water from his hemolytic anemia comes out of the wound. the other interesting thing about that is that it's indicated that it flowed out. Well, depending on how long an interval it was between the soldiers, noticing that he had apparently died and going to Pilate and then coming, back to do the spear poke, the blood would have drained. If he was really dead, the blood would have drained out of him down to his lower extremities. There probably wouldn't have been a flow of blood and water at that point. So that indicates that he was probably still alive at that point. Anyway, for the details, he was drugged. He would have been drugged, I think, 3 times. He would have been drugged by Mary of Bethany when she breaks the spikenard jar and gets it over his feet and supposedly dries it with her hair. She's not drying it, she's spreading it over his foot. They were clearly aware of transdermal or transcutaneous transfer of medicines, herbal and whatever medicines that would travel through the skin, get into the bloodstream, and affect somebody. They were clearly aware of that possibility and how that worked.
And when during Pilate's reign as procurator is this taking place?
I believe that this is taking place in 37. And 37 seems to be the year that both Pilate and Caiaphas, the 2 longest serving officials in that area, so they were obviously good at their jobs, they were both removed at the same time. Now, Josephus says that Pilate was removed because of the Samaritan uprising late in 36. Even if that was the case, it would have taken time to investigate that situation fully and get information to Rome so that they could have an input, perhaps. But I think it's very odd that both of those men, both of those officials, were gone in 37. So there are other reasons why I think that, we could get into the fact that I think that, Jesus was the Samaritan Taheb. And when he actually got to Jerusalem, it was shortly after the Samaritan uprising. And that is kind of proven by the fact that when he gets to Jerusalem, everybody is there waving branches, palm branches, and what have you. Well, that's a sign that he arrived during the Feast of the Tabernacles. That's a tradition of that festival. So that he would have arrived in Jerusalem late in September or somewhere in October, maybe even a little bit later than that, but not much, which gave him time to meet with people and maybe change their attitude about what he was planning.
Do you think that the Samaritan passage in Josephus is basically the crucifixion scene in the Gospels? That's the same scenario.
No, I think there's some, if you're talking about the uprising, no, I think that's a completely different episode. I think that Jesus was considered by the Samaritans to be the Messiah, that what they called the Taheb. That was their name for the Messiah. And that is kind of made clear in the story in the Gospels of the Samaritan woman at the well meeting with Jesus. And Jesus comes up to her and says, give me some water. And her response is kind of, who are you as a Judean to come up and talk to me and what have you?
So I'm just trying to make sure. So I'm just trying to make sure I haven't misunderstood any of these identifications. The unnamed Samaritan prophet and the passage.
Right.
I thought you identified him with Jesus.
Yes.
Do you? Okay,
sure.
you do. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
That's what I thought.
Absolutely. The account in Josephus seems to indicate that, some of the leaders of that uprising managed to get away. And I think Jesus was one of those guys that managed to get away. And then he went from there to Jerusalem, again, at a time of year when the Feast of the Tabernacles was going on. So he goes pretty much straight from the uprising, escapes from the Roman soldiers, and then heads to Jerusalem. That's to me, that's kind of the primary way that you define his entrance into Jerusalem, with everybody waving palm fronds. It's not for him, it's because of the Feast of the Tabernacles. So yes, I do think if you look at the passage in the Gospels about the Samaritan woman at the well, there is a lot of connection there with the Samaritan uprising. Jesus's overall goal was that he realized militarily that he had to have allies to go up against Rome. And one of those allies was really an enemy of most Judeans, Samaria. But he went and tried to gain their support. And that's what the meeting with the woman at the well is about. The woman is a metaphor for the population. Women in the stories throughout the Gospels, in certain stories, are meant to represent the general population. Men in similar stories are meant to be metaphors for Jewish leadership, men in leadership positions. So there's a broader scope to the story than just him meeting a woman at the well. Jesus points, he makes it clear in the story that he's aware of what the Samaritans have been going through as far as political situations, when he says, I know you've been married 5 times, and this person, the last one, you're not even married to. He's talking about leaders of Samaria, and the last one are the Romans, and the Samaritan woman would never have married the Romans. That's why she's being governed by, this guy that she's not married to. He's referring to the Romans being in control of Samaria. Anyway, so he's drugged by Mary in Bethany. I also think he was drugged when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he talks about the cup. I don't think that's, a lot of scholars see that as a metaphorical comment, and it probably is, but I also think it could have been a practical one, that there was another drug that he was taking too. So he would have been taking pain medication. He would have been taking blood staunching medication. These are things that they would have planned ahead on and said, if you're going to go through this ordeal, you have to do this. You have to take these things. And then, of course, I think he was drugged on the cross when he gets the sponge by that stranger that runs up out of the crowd. And then almost immediately appears to die after he is given that drug. So they had planned it pretty well, I think. They knew what they were doing. Then it's just a question of, okay, well, why and how do you make it appear that he is resurrected? And I think the real telling point is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they make it clear that they're waiting for God to intervene. When God comes along and is there to help them against the Romans, then they can start the rebellion or the war. I don't think Jesus was that patient. I don't think he was that fatalistic. I think he was more of a proactive person. I think John the Baptist was definitely an ex-Essene, and he left the sect because he was more proactive and wanted to get things going. So Jesus would have been, drugged 2 or 3 times to get through the ordeal. And if you look at there's one little thing that, most scholars don't seem to touch on that is very important as far as understanding a crucifixion is concerned. And that was a very small piece of olive wood, like a little plate or, a plank that was still attached to a nail going through the heel bone of a crucified victim. That tells you a lot about crucifixion. And I'll show you. I think I've showed you this before. And this is just a crude mock-up. But if you just put a nail through somebody's hand like this, they can ultimately pull their hand off. Yes, it's a horrible thing. Yes, it would be terrible to have to go through. But when you consider that when people are in physical extremes, they can do things that you can't imagine they would do. And the example I would give would be the guy in Utah that cut off his own arm when it was trapped by a boulder when he was out hiking in this canyon. And he'd been there for hours and nobody had come along to help, that could save him or help him. And he realized that if he didn't do something, he was going to die right then and there. So he got out a pocket knife and cut off his own arm. That's how desperate people can become when they're in that kind of physical extreme condition. So you got a situation like this where, there's a nail through the hand. Well, the Romans realized pretty quickly that, people could jerk their hand off. So what they did was they took a piece of olive wood and they used it like that. And they put it like that so that you couldn't pull your hand off. Well, okay, you're halfway there. But then you can still pull your hand this way. You can tear your hand in half if you're in that kind of extreme situation and pull your hand this way. So what the Romans did was they would tie the victim, where am I here? Above the elbow joint so that they could not pull their hand, trying to get this right here, so that they could not pull their hand that way. So the rope is what actually carried the weight of the victim. And the whole purpose of crucifixion was you want to leave the person up on the cross just as long as possible. And you put the crosses along streets and roads that enter the city so that anybody coming in and out of the city has to walk right by these crucified victims and see them suffering. This was like a billboard for the Romans saying, if you don't abide by our rules, this is what's waiting for you. And the crosses would have been low. I think that it probably would have taken just three soldiers to accomplish a typical crucifixion. They weren't super high like they're portrayed in artwork. The Romans wanted it immediate. They wanted it close. They wanted it so almost at eye level for people walking along that road to look up and see the pain and the suffering in the eyes of the crucifixion victim. If you put them on a really high cross, you lose that. You don't get that, connection to the just ordinary people walking by. But if they're at your eye level and you look into their eyes and see what they're going through, that has a much deeper impact. Plus, it saves on wood. There wasn't a lot of, trees and wood available to put up crosses with. So the shorter the cross, the better off they are.
I want to go back to talking about the Samaritan passage real quick.
Sure.
What did this address? Because I'm sure people are going to bring this up in the comments. Because I don't think I've asked you to address this before. People are going to say, well, if the Samaritan is Jesus, didn't Josephus mention the crucifixion of Jesus in that paragraph, that controversial paragraph, Testimonium Flavianum? How do you treat that paragraph? What's your views on that?
Well, if you look at where it's placed in Josephus, it comes right before the paragraph on the Samaritan uprising. So I think the entire thing is an insertion, a later insertion, to direct people to see Jesus the way the Testimonium wants them to see Jesus before they even get to the Samaritan uprising, so that they don't they never have a chance to make a connection between the gospel Jesus and the Samaritan uprising, because here's this testimonium Jesus, and he's like this, and he, this is how we see him, and he's a great man, he's a great teacher, he's this, that, and the other thing. And then a chapter later, you're into the Samaritan uprising. So I think it was inserted right there because Jesus was involved with the uprising. And the TF was meant to deflect readers from making that connection. So I think the whole thing is just a later interpolation for that reason. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah.
So all of that being said, I want to get into the dating of the New Testament. We talked about that, the dating, I think in the first interview. We definitely went into it yesterday in the live stream that we did with Dr. Robert M. Price and Edward Dodge. What led you to conclude that the Gospels have to predate Paul's epistles, which is pretty much backflips the dating from the consensus point of view?
Yeah, first of all, because of some of the things I've already kind of uncovered or realized or put together from, my reading of the historical documents and what have you, I'm not real strong on some of the consensus points of view, obviously. My theories are, 180 degrees away from consensus. The thing that had the most impression on me was that I came to the conclusion pretty early on that the Gospels are political propaganda. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized, political propaganda is only really valuable during the lifetime of whatever leader they're talking about or the life of the movement. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me that the Gospels could have been written as late as consensus theories predict, because that would have been well after the movement and Jesus's, ministry and involvement in the movement, his direct involvement in the movement. So I started looking at that and going, well, then, it's really probably a case that these were written very early, probably in the mid to late 30s, maybe John in the 40s, but certainly Mark and Luke very early on. And there are connections in the Gospels, in the Gospel stories, with historical events, which also made it seem pretty clear to me that these would have been written early on. And I think, I know I've gone over this with you before, but I'll do it again really quickly. The story of the Gadarene or Gerasene demoniac, if you look at the salient features of that story, it's about a man being chained in a cemetery. So he's Jewish, he's ritually unclean 100% of the time, because the Jews had a prohibition about being near either corpses or burial grounds, cemeteries, what have you. Even if your shadow fell on a grave, you could be considered ritually unclean, and you'd have to go through a fairly lengthy process to regain your cleanliness, basically. So there was a huge prohibition against being near a cemetery. And here's this guy chained to the cemetery. So when you see that as a metaphor, then you start looking for historical events that could correlate to that. And if we take the birth year of Jesus to be 6 BCE, and he starts his ministry when he's about 30, that places it at 24 CE when he begins his ministry. And historically, what is happening around that time is the fact that Herod Antipas has built his new capital city in Galilee and called it Tiberius. It's on the lake, right on the lake, shores of the lake. And I don't know whether he didn't realize this when he, directed the city to be built there, but it happened to be built on an ancient cemetery, which meant that anybody living there was going to be ritually unclean all the time, which just wouldn't have worked for the Judeans. So what happened was that they wouldn't live there. So Antipas called in the Roman army from Syria, and they called in the 10th Fretensis Legion to force the Jews to live in that city. Now, there were Greeks and other people that were already inhabiting the city because they weren't concerned with that ritual impurity. But to get the Jews to stay there, they had to have the Roman army to force them to live there. Well, when you look at the story of the Gadarene demoniac, what happens is that Jesus comes along and frees him of his chains, and he is going to perform an exorcism on the demon that's in this guy. And when the demon comes out, Jesus says to him, how are you called? And the demon says, I'm called Legion. And so Jesus casts him out, and the demon turns into 2,000 pigs that run down this hill and drown themselves in the lake, the Sea of Galilee. Well, interestingly enough, the Roman cohort would have been about 2,000 men, and the battle flags of the 10th Fretensis Legion, on there was their mascot, and their mascot was a wild boar. So the pigs are metaphors for the soldiers of the Roman Legion, and that's why the demon says, my name is Legion. There's a direct connection to all of that. I'm kind of surprised that nobody else has ever made that connection, but that's kind of an historical connection to an event that actually took place. In other words, that Roman legion, the 10th Fretensis, was ordered to stay in Tiberius, the city of Tiberius, to keep the Jews there. And that correlates to the story. And there are other things, two other stories that correlate to historical events. So
before we go back,
oh, go ahead, Jacob.
I was just going to say real quick is before we go, just real quick, before we continue on the dating of the New Testament, are there any other figures in Josephus that you identify with Jesus after post crucifixion?
Well, obviously the Samaritan Taheb, the leader of the uprising, yeah, for sure. Jesus ben Ananias, for sure. I think that there's a real strong possibility that the Egyptian could be also, the account of the Egyptian is remarkably close to how Jesus is portrayed in what he was doing. I also think that in Rome, Chrestus causing uprisings within Rome among the Jewish people that were living there very possibly could have been the gospel Jesus. Absolutely. Well, if he survived, as I think he did, the crucifixion, and he lived until 70 CE, he had a long lifespan. That doesn't mean that he gave up the idea of trying to get rid of the Romans. He would have been, even behind the scenes, he would have been politically active in trying to get the Romans out of, Israel. So I think those references in Josephus could well be the gospel Jesus as he went through his life. And the idea, real quickly, the idea, that scholars bring up, well, Jesus was a common name, or, well, there are a lot of those kind of prophets and what, blah, 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 blah. Those are just observations. They're not strong arguments against the idea that Jesus ben Ananias could have been the gospel Jesus. It's not enough to say, well, Jesus was a common name. You got to do the research.
Would you say the doctrine of Adi, although it's a late forgery, fourth century CE forgery from the looks of it. Um, it it mentions the governor Albinus was writing letters to Emperor Tiberius regarding the death, but the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Obviously, the chronology is a bit wrong because even the translator noted in a footnote, oh, it's obviously talking about the governor Albinus. And the text seems to be conflating Jesus Christ with Jesus, son of Ananias.
Well, obviously, I think that conflation is accurate.
Yeah.
I think absolutely right on.
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on. So that's an interesting, add-on to the idea that there was that relationship between.
Yeah, this is the doctrine of that eye.
Yeah, I have not read that. I need to take a look at that.
Yeah.
A lot of things open up if Jesus survived the crucifixion.
It says right here, regarding that which the Jews have done with the cross, Pilate the governor has also written and informed Albinus, my proconsul, of all these things that you have written me. And here's the footnote right here. It says, since no person by the name of Albinus was governor of Judea at the time mentioned in the document, most likely that this name has been confused with that of Albinus, whom Nero made governor of Judea in AD 62. This could be an error made by the original editor of the manuscript.
Could be, absolutely could be. Historians back then, especially, were not super concerned with linear dating of things, being accurate with dates necessarily. They had the attitude that history was rhetoric, that if I'm trying to, and Josephus is very obvious about this in a lot of things, if I'm trying to present a point of view for whatever my personal reasons are, I can pretty much write, the way I need to present that and convince people of my point of view. So, there's a real flexibility there with some of the things that are written and passed along. Now, if you want to get back to the swoon theory real quick.
Sure.
The drug that was given to him on the cross is very interesting because he'd already been offered a drink of gall by the Roman guard, the Roman soldier that was there, and he refused it. And he stayed on the cross for a while longer. And then at a certain point, he calls out, "I thirst." And somebody from the crowd runs up to him and puts a sponge soaked in gall on a hyssop branch and offers it to him, and it touches his lips, and then almost immediately, he succumbs and looks as if he's dead. There's no mention of a hyssop branch when the Roman is offering it. And if what I say about the cross is true, that it's low, he probably could have been reached just by reaching out to him with your hand. The hyssop branch indicates to me that the sponge that was used had been loaded with drugs and had been put between two flat stones and dried so that it was safe to touch for anybody. And the idea of the hyssop branch was that once you reinvigorated those drugs, you couldn't touch it again. So whoever gave it to him, whoever came out of the crowd, used the branch so that they could reactivate the drugs and touch it to Jesus's lips. So that to me is another clear statement in the Gospels of how things were done. The big thing for me with the swoon theory is that there is a magic trick called the empty box. And this is still used by magicians today. And what happens is that either an assistant or the magician himself or herself gets into this box, and something terrible happens to the box and it's squashed flat, and you think, oh my gosh, whoever was in there has got to be dead. And then from behind the curtain or whatever, the magician comes or the assistant comes just fine. The trick involves appearing to go into the box and then immediately coming out of the box where the audience cannot see you coming out of the box. So when the box is squashed, it's been empty the whole time, because whoever went in came out right away. And I think that's how it was dealt with the resurrection, was that Jesus was taken into the tomb. He was cleaned up. His wounds were treated. He was revived from the drugs, using other drugs. And more than likely, his appearance was changed enough so he didn't look just like Jesus. His hair would have been cut. Maybe his beard would have been either completely taken off or cut very shortly. And then the men who had put him in the tomb had to gather around the opening of the tomb and helped each other out of the tomb. And with that, they also helped Jesus out of the tomb. And they gathered around as if they were in mourning, but they gathered around Jesus to support him, and they walked him off. The Gospels indicate that the witnesses were at a distance, and they also indicate that it was done very late in the day after sunset. So it was getting dark. So it would have been very, very difficult for anybody to really see what was going on in the tomb. But I also think that the huge amount of spices and anointing stuff that they had, 75 to 100 pounds, they were used to create the shape of a body, a figure on the bench where the body would have been laid. And a shroud would have been thrown over those to make it look like there was a body on there. That's the only reason you can really explain that inclusion in the story, was, that they were using those, huge amounts of stuff to create an artificial figure on the bench within the tomb. So if anybody did come around and look through there, they would at least see the shape of a body under the shroud. And then I think, from my understanding of the timing of the Gospels and stuff, Jesus was crucified late on the Wednesday and gotten out right away. So when he's talking about, being in the tomb or being in the ground for 3 days or whatever, that was the intention. So he would have been in, all day Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday, kind of at that point. And he was already out. He was already being treated. He was already being brought back to, a physical state where he didn't look as if he'd just been crucified or beaten. And again, there was a guy in the Philippines that actually had nails driven through his hands and his feet during Easter week. And he did this 6 different times until the government stepped in and said, no, you got to stop that. So just the idea of having nail wounds would be enough to, like, oh, he can't be resurrected, if he's showing those kind of wounds. Well, no, there was a guy in the Philippines that had it, done over 6 years. And, he survived every time and managed to go on and, live a normal life. So don't think the wounds were as bad as a lot of scholars seem to think they were. So that, to me, that's pretty much the swoon theory. They drugged him. They knew what they were doing. They had a goal. The goal was that if he was resurrected, that meant that God was on his side. And just as the Essenes were waiting for God to, intrude and step in and help with getting the Romans out, this was Jesus's way of saying, God is bringing me back to life. Therefore, we've got God on our side. We need to start the rebellion.
I'd like to go back to the dating of the New Testament real quick before we close. So you put the Gospels in the late 30s, 40s CE. Does that mean Paul? So do you leave Paul in the mid 1st century CE, 50s, perhaps 60s? Okay.
Paul talks about receiving his indoctrination into the message through revelation and scripture. Now, scholars seem to think that that scripture refers somehow to the Old Testament. I don't think that's true at all. I think he's talking about the Gospels, either one or two, or maybe three of the Gospels, maybe even all four, but he's talking about the Gospels as scripture. So that means that they were written before Paul was writing his epistles. And I also think that at least the first two, Mark and Luke, and I say the order is, it should be Mark, Luke, Matthew, John, but the first two were written by Philo of Alexandria. And Philo passed away sometime around 50 CE. So that's, to me, another indication that they were written quite early, not as late as most scholars, contend now.
And in what way do you think, to what extent was Philo involved in early Christian development?
Well, see, I don't
contributions.
I don't see it, and this is another thing that I struggle with other scholars and stuff when they, write their works. Jesus had nothing to do with Christianity. Philo was not thinking anything about Christianity. It wouldn't have been on the horizon, on their radar. It wasn't part of their lives. It happened later, afterwards. So I don't think Philo had anything to do with, the early stages of Christianity. What I think he had to do with, and quite rightly, was that he was tired of the Romans too. And he was a priest. He had been to the temple at least once that we know about historically. And he was a contemporary of Caiaphas and of Jesus. So very easily could have met them and talked to them, and developed an attitude of, we need to do something to inspire the population to revolt. And since he was, most of his works are allegorical, either about allegory in the Old Testament or about allegories in his own works. And that's pretty much how the Gospels are written, as allegories. So I think he would have been a really strong candidate for the author of Mark and Luke, for sure. And I think politically, he was on the same side that Jesus and Caiaphas were. And you can see that in his some of his writings, especially the Embassy to Gaius and things like that, where he talks about Pilate and he talks about Tiberius and his attitude of being rejected by Caligula.
What led you to the conclusion that Philo wrote Mark and Luke?
The University of Stanford in California, their School of Philosophy did an in-depth study on Philo. And the most striking thing that I saw that came out of that was that he was a unique writer in antiquity, in that he wrote Jewish works, he wrote them in Greek, and he gave them Latin titles. He's the only author in antiquity that did that. So that is like a fingerprint of Philo writing something. And when you look at Mark and Luke, both those names are Latin names. Mark from Marcus, for Mars, the god of war, and Luke from Lucifer, the bringer of light. And I think Mark they're not proper names, they're titles to the works. And so when you see the fingerprint idea and you see that those two gospels are written in that method, you kind of have to draw the conclusion that Philo had something to do with it. Matthew, I'm not so sure of, because Matthew can be a Greek name or it can be a Hebrew name. It is not clearly a Latin name, but certainly Mark and Luke are Latin names. And so that fits in with, his fingerprint, with his method of writing.
Are there any other parallels there? Or does that pretty much cover it?
No, I think that pretty much covers. I came across at least one or two statements in his Philo's writings that matched something that was in the Gospels, but it wasn't vague. It was pretty clear cut. It had something to do with he began his when he was about 30, which parallels, the gospel account of Jesus starting his ministry. Well, he was about 30, but it was so nebulous and whatever. I wouldn't necessarily use that as an argument for confirming that Philo wrote those two gospels, but it's there. And there was something that was a little more vague that kind of paralleled the idea of give unto Caesar what is Caesar and Caesar's, and that was in Philo too. But again, it was not strong enough to use as a guarantee that he actually wrote those things. I think the fingerprint idea, the fact that, Jewish writings written in Greek, Latin titles, I think that matches up with Philo. And early Christians felt that Philo was a Christian, was a believer, that he had, come around to their way of thinking about things. I don't think he felt that way in the beginning. I don't think he had anything, really that connected him to Christianity. But I do see that, he was a very politically minded person and a priest, and he'd been to the temple. So there's a fair amount of correlation there.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.